Hey everyone, and welcome back to the MERN Stack Crash Course. Last episode, we left off having created all the functions in our API.js file that allow us to interact with our backend and do things like pull blog posts from MongoDB, add posts, delete posts, and so forth. Now that we have all these functions, we'll easily be able to call them in our React code as needed. And we were also able to test all these functions so we know that they work just fine. In this episode, we're going to be building out the front end of our application, which means getting our React router set up and getting all of our blog pages made. I'm going to be doing extremely minimal CSS and styling in this episode because we'll have a full episode for making our web app look pretty. Since we're talking about front end, we need to think about how we want our web pages to look like and the functionality we're going to want the user to have. So let's start off by doing some quick brainstorming on some pages we may want in our application. And remember, this project in particular is going to be a blog website, so that's a huge consideration into how our site should look and what it should do. In our app.jsx file, which is the entry point for our front end, I'm going to go ahead and just delete all this testing stuff we messed with last episode, so I can just go ahead and get rid of all this here. I'm going to go ahead and delete everything within this return here, and I'll actually go ahead and delete these imports here too, so we can start off fresh. And then in this component here, I'm just going to make a comment. I'm going to say pages. And now here, we can just brainstorm some pages that we actually want for our website. So let's think about this. When the user first gets to the site, they should be met with a login page where they can log in to access the rest of the site. They should also be able to make a new account to log in if they haven't already made one on this page. For the sake of simplicity, let's just call this a landing page. Next, let's think about what the home page or the main page should look like. On most basic blog sites, the main page or the home page is just a display of all the blog posts, usually filtered by recency or something along those lines. So for this page, we'll call this the home page, and we'll just say something like filtered by recency since we're talking about blog posts. In a lot of apps where there's no dedicated login page, the landing page is the home page. Think about YouTube, for example. Whether you're logged in or not on YouTube, the home page is still going to be the first page you get to. However, in our app, just so I can show you how login works on its own, we're going to separate them out into landing page and home page. On this homepage where we have a list of blogs, the user should be able to click on any blog they actually want to read. When the user clicks on a particular blog title, it should take them to a page where they can read that whole blog, whichever blog that may be. So we'll have our own page for reading this blog. We'll just call this, for right now, we'll just say a read blog page. And while we're on the topic of reading individual blog posts, we know we're going to also need a page to create new blog posts. So we'll make a page for that. We'll just call it a create blog page. And because we're eventually going to add user logins and user information, let's actually make a profile page as well, where a user can see the blogs they've posted and can see other things pertaining to their profile. And then just for the sake of imitating what I'll call, a customer-friendly web app, let's have two more pages. Let's say like an About Us page and then a contact page. All in all, this gives us 7 pages. A landing page, a home page where all the most recent blogs are displayed, a page to read each particular blog, a page to create a new blog, a page for your user profile, and then we have an About Us page and a contact page. So now we have 7 pages, and we know that each one of these 7 pages should be in their own JSX file. So let's actually take each of these pages we want and actually turn them into JSX files. So I'm actually going to go here in my file directory in my front end folder, and I'm going to create a new folder for right now, and I'll just call it pages. And then I'm going to make 7 files, one for each of the pages that we have. So I'll go in here, new file, and I'll do this for each one. We'll have landing.jsx, home.jsx, we had readblog.jsx, createblog.jsx, and then the last 3 we had profile, and then we had an About Us and a contact. So we'll say about.jsx, and then we will also say contact.jsx. We want them all as JSX files because each page is going to be a React component. Off camera, just to save a little bit of time, I filled each of these pages with a basic skeleton component, where I just define its name and then return a div that says the name of the page. We'll worry about filling in the specific contents of these files in just a little bit. Before we do that, we'll want to set up our routing so that we can navigate between these pages that we just made. If you've watched my React course, you know that to make multiple pages in a React app, we need to use the library React Router DOM in order to build the routing scheme. To do this, to get this React Router DOM library, open up your terminal, go ahead and cd into your front-end folder, and then just run the command npm I or npm install and say react-router-dom, and then this will install the React Router DOM package. Once you've installed that package, let's go ahead and head back into app.jsx, where we're rendering the main part of our app. This is the file we're going to use to set up our routes, and this is typically the norm. At the top of this page, there's a few imports that we're going to need for this file, particularly from React Router DOM. We need to import a few things. We need to import, first of all, something called hash router, something called routes, and something called route. And this should all be from React Router DOM. And we'll have to put this in quotes here, just like this. Just to make this hash router easier to represent, let's write as router here so that we can use the alias router to represent hash router. You'll see how each of these three imports comes into play in just a second. Next, we need to import all the pages we want to use. We have 7 pages, so we need to import all 7 of those pages. We'll have to do each of those one by one. So let's go in order of the pages that we see on the left-hand side. So we'll say import about, and all of these should autofill, so you shouldn't have to type them out individually. We'll do import contact, import create blog. This is a little bit tedious, but luckily this is the only time we'll have to do this. So we'll say import home, import landing, import profile, and then lastly, we're going to import read blog, just like this. The next thing we need to do is go down into our return statement here, and we need to wrap our entire app in this router component that we just imported from React Router DOM. This router component, which again is this hash router right here that we're representing with the word router, is basically just a component that allows us to use URLs within our app to navigate between pages. Inside of router, we need to do a routes like this and make sure we have both an opening and a closing one. And this is the second import from React Router DOM. And writing this here tells it that we're about to give it some routes. And then for each individual route that we want, we can render a route component, but we can just do it as a self-closing tag by using this /. We're going to have one of these individual route components for all 7 of our pages. Each of these route components requires 2 arguments or props basically. The first argument is path, which specifies the URL path at which we want to access this route. And the second argument is element, which is the component we want to render at this route. For example, let's say I want to make a route for our landing page. What I could do is type in something like path equals, and for this path, I might just say something like /landing. And then I would say something for the elements. This would actually be JavaScript, and I would pass in our landing component as if we were rendering it. So what does this route here actually mean? Well, what it means is that if I were to go to a URL for our app, and let's say it's like HTTP localhost like 5173 or something, making up something random here. Let's say 5173, and I went to something like /landing like this. I have just specified /landing as the path, and once we reach that path, we're going to render this element, which is our landing page. Let's now do the same process for our other 6 pages. And to speed this up, I can just copy this, and I'm going to paste it 6 times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And now we'll have a route for each one of our 7 pages. But let's change these around to make sure they match accordingly. So let's think. We have a home page, and that the path for the home page we can just say is /home. And at that path, we'll obviously want to render our actual home page component. For this next path, let's say we'll do our create blog. And for that, we'll obviously want to render the create blog component. For read blog, same thing, read blog component. And hopefully you're getting the picture here. Basically, we're just making our own path name, whatever path name we want. And we want to specify what component we want to render at that corresponding path. So for this next one, let's see, we need profile. And we're going to render the profile component at the, let's say, about us page. Let's do /about. We'll render the about page. And then lastly, our contact page will be /contact. And we will render the contact component. Again, each one of these paths refers to a specific URL path on our website, just like this up here. Once that particular path is reached, we want to render a certain component. We want to make sure all of our paths and our corresponding elements match each other. So whenever we hit the landing path, we want to render the landing page. Whenever we hit the home path, we want to render the home page. And hopefully you get the picture. Now we've effectively created 7 routes for a React app, one for each of the 7 pages we're going to have on our site. One quick thing. If you want to specify the default route for your website, meaning the route that users are taken to whenever they first type in your URL, the path for that route should just be a / with nothing after it. Because we want our landing page to be our first route, let's actually change this from /landing to just be a / so that users are automatically directed here. What this means is that if somebody typed in our base URL, if it hosted at this localhost port and it was just like this, then it would say that it is an empty path, so it would take us to the landing page. And that's exactly what we want for this behavior. Now, let me test out these routes so I can show you how they work. So let's actually launch our front end so I can show you. And remember, to launch our front end, we need to make sure we go into our terminal here. So open up our terminal, make sure we're looking in the front end folder, and then run the command npm run dev, and then press enter. And that will generate a link for us to actually open up our website. If we go ahead and hold down Control and then open up the link, it'll take us to our page here. And I'll actually go ahead and readjust these folders here so that we can get this looking correct. And I'll go ahead and shrink this down here and close down our terminal to make a little more space. For right now, we're going to manually test our routes using this URL up here at the top. When using routes with HashRouter, we actually need to use a hashtag or pound symbol in here. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in here, and then we can add whatever path we want after that. Whenever we get into using link buttons later on, it'll do that automatically for us, because obviously we don't want users to have to type in the URL bar. If we just have no route here in the URL, we can see that we're looking at the landing page because that's what we specified over here as our default route. If right here I typed /home, you can see now it would take us to the home page. If I went /profile, now we're on the profile page, and hopefully you get the picture. Because in the app we specify each particular route where the element is the element prop is the component we want to render, and then the path prop is the path we want to render that component at. So for example, for this home route here, we said the path is /home and the element is the home component. Therefore, that's why when we go to the /home route here, it renders the homepage component. This makes it super easy for us to add pages and see how the pages work. Before we move on, we should add something to our read blog route right here. Keep in mind that every individual blog post we have will have a link to their own unique post page where users can read that blog post. Right now, however, I can show you, if I just go to the read blog page, we're just going to one page that isn't unique to anything. And if we were to try and implement it right now, every time a link is clicked, it would take us to this one singular page, which is not what we actually want. An easy way we can differentiate each post is to put that particular post ID within this path itself. This will allow us to use the ID to show each post uniquely, and the easy way to add an ID in the path is just to write /:, and then whatever you want the ID name to be, which I'll just name ID, right after the initial path. Now, whatever comes after this colon here will be stored in this ID variable, which we'll be able to access on that page. And you'll see why this becomes important later down the road. We saw a very, very similar concept when we were working with our backend routes. So for example, if I were to go in here for read blog, and I were to go read blog /12345, this 12345 is now equal to this ID right here. And you see it actually is not rendering our page anymore because it's going to tell us there's an error because we haven't specified any ID yet. So I'm going to go ahead and just take this away. Let's go ahead and go back to our home page and make sure this file is saved. Let's think about what we want next. It doesn't make a lot of sense to require users to type in the path of the page you want to go to in this URL bar. Like if I'm a user, I don't want to say, oh, I want to go to the home page. Let me just type in /home. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Ideally, we'd have buttons on our website that users can click that allow them to navigate between different pages. This can be done through a Navbar, which is a simple menu usually at the top of the page that has links to all the different pages you can visit, which essentially every modern website has in some way, shape, or form. I've gone over how to make a Navbar in my React course, but now I'll go over it in a quicker fashion so we can get started with the more important stuff, like actually filling out the content of our pages. The first thing we need to do to make a functional Navbar is to actually make two components. And before I make the components themselves, I'll actually make a dedicated components folder to store them. So I'm going to go in our front end here. I'm going to go new folder. Then I'm just going to name this folder just components just to make it easy. And then in this folder, I want to make two components. The first component should be the Navbar itself. So I'll name it navbar.jsx because these should be React components. And then the next one will be one called layout.jsx, which will represent the layout of the site. And both of these components will quickly write the skeleton component. So for Navbar, I'll say export function Navbar, and then we'll just return an empty div for right now. I'll do the same in layout. I'll say export function layout, and then we'll do the same thing where we return just an empty JSX div. In this layout file, we need to import two things to make this file work the way we intend it. The first one is the Navbar component we just created, so we'll import that first. I'll say import navbar. And then the second is a React Router DOM component called outlet. So I'll go ahead and import that next. We'll say import outlet from React Router DOM. And then all we need to do in this layout file is pretty simple. We need to render the navbar, and then right under that, we need to render the outlet. And that's it for this file. I go into a really detailed explanation of how this whole layout file works, plus this whole outlet thing works in my React specific course. But basically, long story short, outlet is something we can use with parent routes that allows us to render child routes. Right now, we just have in our app.jsx file, we just have 7 routes that aren't parents or children of each other. But that will change when we add the navbar. And what this outlet allows us to do is render our navbar in whichever pages that we want. And the whole main reason why we're doing this is because there's some pages like the landing page that we don't want the navbar to display on. So now that we're done in this file, let's save it and let's head into our navbar component and work on getting it set up. One of the first things I want to do is import the link component from React Router DOM. So we'll say import link from React Router DOM. This link component here basically acts as a button that we can click to navigate between the routes that we've made. So it's super important if we're wanting to create a navbar for our pages. Next, what we want to do is create links for each of our pages, -2 of them. It wouldn't make sense to create a link for the landing page in our navbar, and it also wouldn't make sense for the read blog page to be up there as well, considering that page should get activated whenever we click on a particular blog, not from the navbar. That means we need 5 links for the other 5 pages. There are a couple of ways we can do this. The first way would just be writing all the links in this file, one for each page, just like this. I could say, a link for the home page. I would do a link for the profile page, a link for the create blog page, and so forth. The second method would be to extract the page info into another file and just map over it. Each of these 5 links that we're going to make will have the exact same format, so let's actually go with the second option, because we'll avoid duplicate code with this method, which will require us not to have to write, link over and over and over again. Plus, you'll thank yourself later if you want to add more pages because it'll make it easier. If I go with this method of extracting data into another file, usually how I do it is I go into our components folder here and I'll make a new file. I will call it pagedata.js. And this isn't going to be a React component, just a JavaScript file. That's why it's .js and not JSX. And all we're going to do in this file is make an array of objects, where each object represents the information for one page. And then once we go back to our navbar, we'll just map over this array and render a link for each one. So let's go ahead and close this, head back to our pagedata.js page. And we're going to export this array here to our navbar file. So let's write export const, and we'll just call it the same name as the file. We'll say page data equals, and we want it to be an array. Oops, missed the equals there. And it'll be an array just like this. We know we're going to want 5 pages, hence we're going to need 5 objects. So let's use curly brackets to denote the first object. And then we need to give it 2 properties. We can give it more than that, but 2 is what we're going to stick with for right now because that's all we're going to need essentially. It'll be name, and it'll also be path. The name will be the text we show on the button itself, and the path will be the URL we want to navigate us to. So we'll want to make sure this path here matches exactly how we specified it when we first made our routes in app.jsx. So for example, for our home page, we want it to be named home, just like this, and we would want the path to be /home. And because we're going to want an object for each one of our pages, let's actually just copy this here, comma, let's copy it, and let's make one of these for each one of our pages. For this next one, we'll say its name will be create blog, because that's what we want to display in our navbar. And this path should be create blog, again, matching the routes we made in app.jsx. This one will say just the profile page, and that's /profile. This one right here will say about us, and that will be /about. And then the last one will be named contact, and that path is obviously just /contact. And that's actually all we need to do in this file because all we're doing is just containing the information for our page routes. So let's actually go now back to our navbar.jsx file, and we can now take this information and map over it. The first thing we'll need to do is import the data we just created in that file. So let's say import page data from the page data file. And then all we need to do is actually really simple. We'll go in here. We'll use curly brackets to know that we're using a JavaScript expression. And let's map over this array that we just imported. So to do that, we'll say page data.map. And then for each page, we're going to want to, for each page, we're going to want to return something. And I'll make sure we have our return statement here so it can return some JSX for each page that we have. And now here's where we can specify what we want each button on the navbar to look like. For one, each button should be a link component from React Router DOM because they should each link to a page. Therefore, let's make this outer level component here, this outer level div here. We will make that a link. Each link needs to have a to prop that specifies where we want the link to lead to. Lucky for us, we already specified the path to each link within the objects that we just made because each object has a property called path. So that means it's stored in what we call page.path. So inside the link here, we can say to, and we'll say page.path just like this. When we're mapping over page data, this page object here is set equal to each individual object in our page data file. And each object has a property name and path, hence why we're able to say page.path and it'll work. Inside each link, let's actually render a button component just so we can get some of the automatic button styling from JSX. We'll do button like this, and the button should have the name of whatever page we're clicking to. So therefore, we use curly brackets, and we just want to say page.name, again accessing one of the properties of the object because it has the properties name and path for each one. So if we want to get the name of it to display on the button itself, we can just say page.name. And this is actually all we need functionality-wise to get our navbar to work. But before we add our navbar into app.jsx to actually render it into our app, let's add some quick CSS just to put it on the top of the screen and make the buttons look at least somewhat decent. I'm actually going to wrap this entire return here in a actual div. And then I'm going to give this a class name. Class name is how we do CSS in React. I'll say class name equals, let's just call this navbar. And then for each particular link, which represents each button on our navbar, I'm going to make another class name for CSS that I'm just going to call nav item. Now that we have these class names, let's actually access our CSS file. When we first made the project with V, it put all the CSS into this app.css file. So let's go ahead and navigate to here. Let's go to the bottom and let's add a property for each class name we just made. So we said our first one was navbar and the other one we had was nav item. Again, I'm just doing super minimal CSS for this episode because we'll have our own episode dedicated towards that. But for now, let's think about what we want to be super minimalistic. So we want it to be fixed at the very top of the screen. And let's just say for right now, we want the navbar to cover, let's say 50% of the screen. To do that is pretty easy. Let's just say position is going to be fixed. We will say top is 0. And let's say width 50%. This will make sure the navbar stays fixed, is at the very top of the page, and takes up 50% of the screen width. Let's actually now center it as well. 50% of the width is covered by the navbar, meaning that if we did a property like this, we said left 25%, that will actually center it since this sets the left margin 25%. I also want the nav buttons in this navbar to be evenly spaced out as well as possible. To do this, we can just add a few more properties. We'll say display flex, and then we can just add justify content will be space between. This is all we'll need to do with the navbar class for now. And then for the nav item, let's just do a couple of things. Let's give each one some like padding and margins. So we'll say padding for it will be 4 pixels. Let's say margins also 4 pixels. Let's make the buttons white. We'll say color white. Border style. Let's do a solid border just so we can give them a little outline. Let's make each border 2 pixels wide. So we'll say border width is 2 pixels. And then the last thing I want to do is just make sure each button is rounded a little bit to make it look a little nicer. We can round each button by saying border radius. Let's do 4 pixels for right now. And this is just some super basic CSS, which like I said, we'll add a lot more of down the road. But for right now, we'll keep it at this. So we'll go ahead and save the file. We spent the last few minutes getting our navbar and site layout all set up. So now let's actually get it added into our code, which is actually pretty simple. In our app.jsx page, let's scroll to the top and let's import the 2 components we just made. The first one was the navbar, and then the second one was the layout. And then here's how this site layout is going to come into play. We know we aren't going to want the navbar to be displayed on the landing page. We only want it to display once the user logs in and is on the site. Therefore, this landing page here should be its own route. However, this is where the outlet we made earlier in the site layout, and let me show here, this is where the outlet here will actually come into play. All pages that would like to have a navbar on it, like the home page, contact page, etc., should now all be made child routes of this layout component, meaning they'll get rendered as this outlet here. And I'll show you exactly how to do that. So let's head back to our app.jsx page, shrink this, and let's look back at these routes here. We need to make another route under our landing route, except this time we need to give it both an opening and a closing tag. And for this route, we don't need to specify a path for this route, just an element. So we can say element equals, and we want this element to actually be the layout component that we just made. And then all of the pages that we want a navbar on will get nested in between these tags. We want a navbar on all of these pages down here. So let's actually cut and paste these routes inside of this layout route here. Now what we have is the landing page route on its own entirely. And then we have a parent component, which is the layout, which contains the navbar, and then all its child components are all our other routes, meaning in effect that the navbar is only present on pages that are children of this layout route. If you want a more detailed explanation on how this works, check out my video on routing as part of my React course, which I'll link in the description. To get the moment of truth, let's go ahead and Control S to save this file. And you'll see some buttons actually appeared at the top of our screen, and this is the navbar we just created. Honestly, it looks pretty ugly, but it'll do for right now. Let's run some testing to ensure this new navbar works the way that we intended to. Let's actually go back to our landing page. Let's go /here, just so we can look at our landing page. And you can see on our landing page, we actually have no navbar, which is exactly what we want. Then let's navigate to homepage, so we'll go /home, and now the navbar reappeared. We'll take care of jumping between our landing page and homepage once we get our user login stuff done. Here on our homepage, you can see we have our navbar with the 5 buttons on it for each of the pages we want to navigate to. I can click between these buttons and now navigate to whichever page that I want. Notice how each time I click the button, it's actually changing my URL path up here, which is being done by the link component from React Router DOM that we used in the navbar. Now that we've tested this, we can see that we have got a fully functional navbar. Again, it doesn't look super pretty, but we'll worry about that later down the road when you do our styling and CSS episode. And that's where we're going to end this episode. In this episode, we figured out the page structure we're going to use for our front end, and we created template files for each of those pages. We've also got all of our routes set up with React Router and made a functional navbar that allows us to navigate between all of our pages. In the next episode, we'll focus on filling out each of these individual pages. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.